For over a century, millions of Jehovah's Witnesses around the world have built their entire faith on a single pivotal year, 607 BC. This date, this one specific moment in ancient history, isn't just a footnote in their beliefs. It's the foundational cornerstone. It's the starting point of a prophetic countdown that directly leads to 1914, the year they assert Jesus Christ began his invisible heavenly rule. But here's the deeply unsettling question that millions are conditioned not to ask. What if that date is factually wrong? What if the entire, elaborate doctrine about 1914, the very authority of the governing body, their exclusive claim to be God's sole true organization on earth, was all constructed upon a mistake? Not a minor calendrical slip, but a fundamental 20-year chronological error. I realize this is a bold and even jarring claim. And it's true, it is. But I urge you to stay with me, because what I'm about to present is not based on mere opinion or so-called apostate literature. It is grounded in archaeology, ancient records, and verifiable historical evidence that any diligent person can confirm. This is evidence the Watchtower Society itself is aware of, yet systematically chooses to disregard. Today, we're going to proceed with intellectual integrity. We're going to follow the evidence trail wherever it leads. We're going to ask the necessary, hard questions. We must understand where the truth truly lies, because if the date of 607 BC is incorrect, everything built upon it structurally collapses. And that includes some very high-stakes claims about a divine mandate. So let's begin at the beginning. Let's clearly establish what the Watchtower actually teaches, and why the integrity of this single date matters so profoundly. What the Watchtower teaches. The Watchtower Society asserts that in 607 BC, the powerful Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, accomplished the total destruction of the city of Jerusalem. This devastating event, they teach, marked the absolute beginning of a significant prophetic period they term the appointed times of the Gentiles. Based on their specific interpretation of Scripture, primarily the book of Daniel, they calculate this period would last precisely 2,520 years. When you count forward 2,520 years from 607 BC, the timeline culminates dramatically in the year 1914 AD. The year 1914 is far more than a historical marker for Jehovah's Witnesses. It is the absolute cornerstone of their entire belief system. They teach that in October 1914, Jesus Christ was installed and enthroned as King in heaven. He commenced his invisible rule, and a mere 3.5 years later, in 1919, he supposedly inspected all religious organizations on earth and definitively selected the Bible students, who would later be renamed Jehovah's Witnesses, as his exclusive, true, and faithful organization. This selection claim is absolutely critical. If Jesus chose them in 1919, it logically follows that the governing body today speaks with divine authority. They are, by their own doctrine, God's sole channel of communication to all humanity. Every teaching, every moral rule, every life-altering disfellowshipping decision flows directly from this claimed, non-negotiable authority. And that profound authority rests entirely on the prophetic chronology that must begin in 607 BC. Do you now see the immense significance? This isn't just a dry academic debate about ancient history. This is about whether millions of people are following an organization with legitimate, verifiable divine backing, or one that has simply built a life-controlling structure upon a fundamental, critical mathematical error. So, the question is simple. Is 607 BC the correct, historically attested date for the destruction of Jerusalem? Let's examine what secular history and archaeology unequivocally demonstrate. Here is where the reality becomes profoundly uncomfortable for the Watchtower. When you scrutinize the actual historical and archaeological evidence, a very strange picture emerges. Every mainstream historian, every archaeologist, every ancient Near Eastern scholar, and every academic institution in the world points to a completely different date. Not 607 BC, but 587 BC. Some scholars cite 586 BC due to differing calendar calculations, but the core consensus is clear. Jerusalem fell approximately 20 years later than the Watchtower's required date. Perhaps you think, historians always disagree on minor points. And while that's generally true, this is not one of those cases. The evidence supporting 587 BC is not just strong, it is overwhelming and multi-layered. We are not dealing with a few ambiguous documents or one person's speculative interpretation. We are dealing with multiple independent lines of evidence from disparate sources, all converging on the same precise chronological conclusion. Let me elaborate. The fall of Jerusalem was not a minor, isolated event. It was a major campaign within the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is one of the most meticulously documented periods in all of ancient history. The Babylonians were scrupulous, obsessive record keepers. They documented virtually everything on durable clay tablets: business transactions, astronomical observations, military campaigns, and royal decrees. Thousands upon thousands of these tablets have been discovered, translated, and meticulously catalogued. These tablets provide an extremely precise, interlocking chronology of Babylonian kings. We know definitively when each king began his reign, the exact length of his rule, and when he died. This verified royal chronology has been repeatedly confirmed by independent archaeological findings. Crucially, we possess astronomical diaries that record historical eclipses and planetary positions. These can be precisely checked against modern astronomical calculations, and they match perfectly. We have business documents dated by specific regnal years. We have king lists. We have clear synchronisms with Egyptian and Persian history. All this evidence forms an unbreakable, interlocking web of dates that cannot be shifted by 20 years without utterly fracturing the entire established historical system. And within this universally accepted system, Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem consistently falls in his 18th or 19th year of reign, which corresponds to 587 or 586 BC, not 607 BC. To be more specific, consider concrete examples. The Babylonian Chronicle. This is an ancient cuneiform tablet that precisely records the major events of each year during the Neo-Babylonian period. It explicitly mentions Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns, including his siege of Jerusalem. When correlated with astronomical data, the dates on this tablet definitively point to 587 BC. The Canon of Ptolemy, compiled by the astronomer Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, this is a highly reliable list of kings and their reign lengths. Ptolemy used this list, anchored by specific astronomical observations, to create accurate calendars. The dates in his canon, which have been independently verified, placed Jerusalem's destruction in 587 BC. The VAT 4956 tablet. This is a Babylonian astronomical diary that meticulously records the positions of the moon and planets during Nebuchadnezzar's 37th regnal year. When modern astronomers back-calculate those exact planetary positions, they arrive at the year 568 BC. Counting backward 37 years from that date, Nebuchadnezzar's first year of reign was 605 BC. His 18th year, the year Jerusalem fell, would therefore be 587 BC. There are countless other tablets like these: commercial ledgers, temple records, and administrative texts. All are dated by the regnal years of Babylonian kings. All fit seamlessly into a single, consistent, verifiable chronology. And all overwhelmingly point away from 607 BC. So, here is the stark, uncomfortable truth. The Watchtower's date of 607 BC is not supported by a single ancient document. Not one. The only organization in the entire world that holds to this date is the Watchtower Society. Every major museum, every university, every archaeology department, every single scholar specializing in this period unanimously affirms 587 BC. The Watchtower stands absolutely alone. But why? Why would they cling so tenaciously to a date that lacks any credible historical support? That is the essential question we must now address. Why the Watchtower needs 607 BC? The answer is strikingly simple, and it explains why this issue holds such immense importance. They need 607 BC to make their prophetic math work. As established, their entire doctrinal system depends on counting exactly 2,520 years from the supposed destruction of Jerusalem to arrive at 1914. If you start from the historically correct date of 587 BC and count forward 2,520 years, you do not reach 1914. You arrive at 1934 AD. And 1934 simply does not work. Nothing prophetically dramatic or world-changing occurred in 1934 from the Watchtower's perspective. World War I, which they primarily cite as proof of the last day's beginning, was already years past. There was no cataclysmic global event they could point to and confidently declare, "See, this undeniable evidence proves Jesus began ruling in heaven." Therefore, they are chronologically locked in. They cannot change the date without immediately dismantling their entire theological structure. And that structure supports some incredibly significant claims. Claims about unique divine authority, claims about being the exclusively chosen organization of God, and claims that effectively maintain absolute loyalty, obedience, and willingness to sacrifice among millions of their followers. Consider the immense institutional stakes. If 1914 is chronologically incorrect, then the subsequent claim that Jesus inspected all religions in 1919 and chose them collapses. If that claim collapses, the governing body's fundamental claim to speak for God falls apart entirely. If their claim to divine channel status falls, then every single teaching, rule, and major policy they have enacted loses its divine mandate. The insidious two-witness rule for child abuse cases. The agonizing shunning policy. The rigid blood doctrine. All of it rests on the assertion that they were chosen by Christ and speak with his authority. That absolute claim to authority traces directly back to 1914, which in turn traces directly back to 607 BC. One single date. One deeply flawed calculation. Remove that foundational date, and the entire edifice of their organizational authority is called into question. To be fair, the Watchtower is not entirely silent on this issue. They are fully aware of the overwhelming historical evidence. They know that virtually every scholar disagrees with their chronology. So, how do they attempt to defend 607 BC against a torrent of historical facts? Their primary and most consistent argument is essentially this. They contend that while secular evidence points to 587 BC, the faithful must trust the Bible over worldly history. They claim that the Bible itself provides an internal chronology that supports 607 BC, and since the Bible is God-inspired, it must inherently be more reliable than ancient clay tablets. On the surface, this might sound reasonable to a follower dedicated to biblical authority. However, there is a massive, crippling problem. The Bible does not explicitly state that Jerusalem was destroyed in 607 BC. It does not provide that specific, absolute date. What the Bible does provide are relative time references. For instance, it mentions Jerusalem's fall in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and it refers to an exile period of 70 years. But to translate these relative references into a specific, absolute calendar date, you must anchor them to the surrounding secular chronology. You absolutely need those clay tablets. You need those astronomical observations. In short, you cannot escape secular history entirely. Everyone, including the Watchtower, must use it to establish and verify their dates. The core question becomes, do you use that history honestly and comprehensively, or selectively and self-servingly? And here is where the argument becomes disingenuous. The Watchtower uses the established secular chronology only when it supports their views, and rejects it wholesale when it does not. For example, they readily accept that the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC. How do they know that date? Because of secular historical records. The very same types of records, from the same civilizations, using the same meticulous methods that conclusively point to 587 BC for Jerusalem's destruction. They cannot have it both ways. They cannot selectively declare the Babylonian records reliable for the date 539 BC, but entirely unreliable for the date 587 BC. The Watchtower also attempts to cast broad, sweeping doubt on the archaeological consensus by labeling it secular or worldly wisdom, implying that archaeologists are somehow deliberately biased against them. This is a gross misrepresentation. Archaeologists are not engaged in a secret plot to disprove Jehovah's Witnesses. Most scholars are wholly unaware of the 607 BC controversy. They are simply doing their professional work, translating ancient documents, verifying astronomical data, and following where the undeniable evidence leads. Furthermore, the Watchtower occasionally advances arguments that are demonstrably factually incorrect. They've long claimed that the 70 years mentioned in the book of Jeremiah must refer to 70 years of complete desolation with absolutely no one left alive in the land. Yet, even a careful, objective reading of the biblical text disproves this strict interpretation. Jeremiah 29 describes letters being sent to exiles in Babylon, implying not everyone was taken captive, and 2 Kings 25 mentions that some of the poorest inhabitants were explicitly left behind to tend the vineyards. The idea of total unbroken desolation for precisely 70 years is an organizational interpretation, not a clear, explicit biblical statement. Let's pause and consider the tangible meaning of this. For over 100 years, millions of people have fundamentally structured their entire lives around a date that has no historical support whatsoever. They have made profound, life-altering decisions based on the sincere belief that 1914 heralded the immediate beginning of the final, last days, and that the ultimate end is imminent. Think of the human cost. People have refused life-saving blood transfusions. People have avoided higher education and meaningful career paths. People have postponed having children or building financial security because they were repeatedly taught the end was coming soon. People have cut off deeply loved family members who dared to question the organization's teachings. People have endured the crushing isolation, shunning, and profound psychological trauma simply for raising doubts. And all of this suffering was endured for what? For a chronology built on a date that simply does not exist in a single credible historical record. Consider the young person who skipped university because the organization decreed higher education was a waste of time in these supposed last days. Consider the parents who refused a blood transfusion for a desperately ill child, genuinely believing they were obeying God's supreme law. Think of the families permanently ripped apart by the shunning policy, which is enforced with absolute, unyielding authority because the organization claims divine, non-negotiable backing. All these severe policies, all these massive sacrifices, fundamentally rest on the foundation that the governing body is speaking for God. And that ultimate claim rests on 1914. And 1914 rests on 607 BC, a date that history proves never happened. This is not merely an obscure academic argument. This is about real lives, real families, and real, ongoing human suffering. It is happening because an organization stubbornly refuses to admit a decades-old, foundational mistake. The broader pattern. What makes the 607 BC issue even more troubling is that it is not an isolated incident. It is a clear part of a broader, systemic pattern where the organization consistently prioritizes the maintenance of its own authority over the pursuit of factual truth. Over the decades, the Watchtower has made numerous significant predictions and claims that have repeatedly proven false. They predicted the world's end in 1914, then 1925, and then 1975. Each time these predictions spectacularly failed, they did not issue a sincere apology or admit their error clearly. Instead, they typically blamed their followers for reading too much into their statements, or for having wrong expectations. They have also repeatedly and dramatically changed major doctrines. Their core understanding of this generation, in Matthew 24, has been redefined multiple times. Their teaching on who will be resurrected has been altered. Their rules concerning acceptable medical treatments have shifted, sometimes with fatal consequences for those who strictly obeyed the older, now rejected rules. But what never changes is their relentless claim to absolute authority. No matter how many times they are proven wrong, no matter how much evidence contradicts their position, they persistently claim to be God's sole, unique channel of truth. And they demand absolute, unquestioning obedience. Question them, and you risk the ultimate, catastrophic loss. Your family, your friends, and your entire social support system. That is precisely why the 607 BC controversy is so important. It exposes the organization's operational method. When overwhelming evidence contradicts the organizational claims, the organization does not pivot or change. It instead doubles down on the error. It immediately dismisses the evidence. It attacks the motives of those who present the evidence. And in doing so, it successfully maintains control over millions of lives. If you are a Jehovah's Witness viewing this, I understand this information is incredibly difficult, perhaps terrifying, to process. I know you've been taught your entire life that questioning the organization is tantamount to questioning God Himself. I know you've been warned constantly about apostates who allegedly spread wicked lies to cause people to stumble. And I know you have invested years, perhaps decades, of your life, love, and loyalty into this belief system. But I ask you to sincerely consider one very simple question. If the truth is truly the truth, what does it genuinely have to fear from rigorous, open investigation? If 607 BC is the correct date, then the overwhelming historical evidence should confirm and support it. If the organization is genuinely God's chosen channel, it should be able to provide solid, irrefutable proof, not merely circular reasoning and repeated assertions of authority. You don't need to accept my analysis. Do your own private research. Visit a public library. Look up the Neo-Babylonian chronology. Read what credible archaeologists and ancient historians say. Read the Watchtower's own publications on the topic and carefully analyze how they selectively handle the evidence. Note which historical sources they cite and which they choose to ignore. Pay close attention to any instance where they quote scholars out of context or deliberately misrepresent their professional positions. Then, ask yourself honestly, does this look like an organization that is supremely confident in its factual position? Or does it look like an organization that is desperately struggling to maintain a necessary narrative despite overwhelming, contradictory evidence? For well over a century, a single unverified date has held millions of sincere people in its powerful grip. 607 BC. A date that is conspicuously absent from all ancient records. A date that directly contradicts every piece of available, verifiable historical evidence. A date that exists exclusively within the publications of a single religious organization. Yet, this unsupported date has profoundly shaped lives, torn families apart, and sustained an authority structure that demands absolute, unquestioning obedience. Because if 607 BC falls, 1914 falls. If 1914 falls, the critical claim of divine selection in 1919 falls. If that selection claim falls, the entire basis for the governing body's ultimate authority falls. This discourse is not intended to be negative or hurtful to anyone's personal faith. This is fundamentally about truth. Real truth. The kind of truth that possesses the confidence not to hide from evidence or silence legitimate questions. The kind of truth that can withstand rigorous investigation and scrutiny. So, perhaps the core question isn't, who has the truth? Maybe the real, critical question is, what happens when you realize the very foundation of your beliefs is built on sand? What happens when you definitively discover that the date everything depends upon was fundamentally wrong from the very beginning? That is the profound question every single Jehovah's Witness must ultimately ask themselves. Not because someone else told them to, but because the undeniable historical evidence demands it. The truth about 607 BC is not hidden in some obscure, inaccessible scholarly journal. It is plainly written on thousands of durable clay tablets, confirmed by modern astronomical calculations, and verified by multiple, independent historical sources. It is hiding in plain sight. The only remaining question is, are you willing to truly look at it?